Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm your host, Catherine Taylor. This is season 4, and boy, I'm excited. I'm enjoying all the people I have who are going to join me and the lineup. Let's Get Writing here is where you can find inspiration and ideas. We bring life to books and so much more. Now, my guest this week on Let's Get Writing was a roommate and colleague of Ray Guy in his evening telegram days, which was a while ago, but we're going to learn all about that. He originally grew up in Heart's Delight, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is a graduate of Memorial University of Newfoundland and also Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto. And after a print journalism background that included 5 years with the Evening Telegram, he worked for more than 30 years with the CBC as a journalist, producer, and executive. He now calls Glen Haven, Nova Scotia home and is currently a senior investigator with the Nova Scotia Office of the Ombudsman. That was quite an introduction. And now I'm going to welcome him to the show. Thank you so much. Ron, Ray Guy, Portrait of a Rebel, your book. It's a testament and a toast, really, to his brilliant writing, and also a very compelling biography of a very complex man who had an incredible gift. And I also feel he was so much a part of our culture here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and many people knew him. They felt like they knew him personally because of his showing up in newspapers and on different shows. And I'm sure your book's going to be read by many people here and far away. But the first thing I want to ask you, and if I'm almost thinking if Ray Guy was here with me, he might have said, "Oh, it's a fool's mission." But why did you write this book? What inspired you?
Well, the book was and is designed to do almost exactly what you said earlier, which is to declare a kind of testimonial to Guy's writing, make it better known, and also make Guy better known as a human being and as a professional, and to try and expand and recover interest in his work. It was a long time ago, as you say, although he did write for 4 decades up until, well into the current century, as closer to 5 decades. So there is a considerable canon of work there. Ray passed away in 2013. And I think it's time to kind of remind people of what an extraordinary writer he was, and why his work is well worth another look, perhaps by another generation, and perhaps by different readers in different parts of the country.
And Ron, when I was reading the book and going through, and you've introduced so much of his writing in the book, pieces of it, and then explanations of what was happening at that time, you really created a portrait of him that was amazingly, I want to say tactile, or just I felt almost like I was getting to know him through what you did, but it must have been a tremendous amount of work. How did you go about approaching that project?
Well, I had a head start in many ways, or several head starts, in that, as you say, I knew him and worked with him, and we shared apartments for a few years and so on. So we were friends and remained friends all of our lives, although our careers diverged. I spent much of mine out of Newfoundland, and he spent all of his there. So I had that as a head start. And having worked with him, I'd already read considerable amounts of his writing, and I followed him as closely as I could from a distance for all of his career. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work in Newfoundland for a couple of years in the 1980s, and for about 9 years or so in the 1990s. So I reconnected with him, and I read all his books, and fortunately a lot of his material has been compiled into compilations in books. So it's fairly readily accessible. Nevertheless, it still took a pile of work at the archives and at the Newfoundland Center at Memorial to ferret out things that had not made it between the covers of books. and also to track down a lot of his post-telegram writing, which was much more scattered. The telegram writing was relatively easy to come by because it's all in one place or a small number of places. Um, Once he became a freelance for what I refer to in the book and others have referred to as his second career, it was a little harder to track down because he had to, as a freelance person trying to make a living, um, he had to write for just about any publication that would have him, um, which is not to say that his writing was compromised in any way, but it is to say that you got to take it as it comes when you're a freelance person. So that took quite a lot of work. But then I spent a lot of time at it. It was done over about 5 years in fits and starts. And I did take a couple of leaves of absence from work to work on it um, with undivided attention. So it took some time, but I don't feel any the worse for it.
Well, I can feel that as I read the book. As a writer and someone who's actually I wrote a thesis, someone who's done something like that, you have a feel for the type of book that it is and how much work it really would be to put it together and with so much respect. You mentioned, and I want to ask you a little bit about it. You guys were roommates at one point. What was that experience like? And was that part of the factor of why you wanted to tell his story in this way?
Well, he was a great roommate. Neither of us were chefs, and for a period of time there were two of us, and for other periods of time there were three of us. Other people joined us for months or a year or so at a time. That was kind of typical. I was in my student days, so I had to have roommates anyway. Might as well have a good one. uh, and we started that when we worked together at the paper. It was fun. By and large, it was fun. If it had a few minor drawbacks, one of them was the fact that I like to sleep. I tend to sleep during the night. Ray Guy tended to sleep during the day, so we'd sometimes collide on our schedules, but relatively minor matters.
You're taking me back to a time in my past as well. Those days of living like that. And that was the time when you worked at the Evening Telegram. And when I was reading in your book about that, it just really brought it to life for me as well. But what was it like? It was almost like a timepiece, that old newspaper room that we all think about. How was that? And that's where Ray did a lot of his work, albeit maybe at odd hours. But those were the days when you could smoke and do different things in a very confined environment.
Yeah. Well, I think smoking and a certain amount of drinking were pretty much mandatory in that business. It was a long time ago. I mean, when I was writing the book, I actually felt that I was there, and that all these people, many of whom are deceased, were still around. And the exercise was an interesting one in that respect because it really brought back a lot of these people and their personalities and their interesting quirks and dispositions. It did bring it all back. So there's a sense in which for much of the time when I was working on the book, and particularly when I was working on it for periods of days or weeks intensely, I really felt that I was back there. But they were interesting times. These were open newsrooms, which for a time disappeared and I think came back, and I think have disappeared again now because people tend to be working at home and doing programs like this from their living rooms or wherever. I'm in my house. But these were open rooms, and as you say, everybody did smoke. Pretty much everybody did smoke. So you weren't the healthiest environments under the sun for sure. But there was a high level of collegiality. By and large, the levels of humor and wit were extremely high. And the place is full of characters. I mean, Guy was a character in his own right and a substantial one, but he was one of many for sure. And for somebody like me who started working with that crowd when I was like 16 or about just turning 17, it really was an educational experience but also a highly entertaining one. What it did do in my case, and Ray was certainly quite influential, is that it kind of captured me for a career path that essentially I was able to maintain for most of my working life anyway. But they were different times. They exist now really only in a few books like mine and a few good movies, I guess.
Yeah, true. Mad Men maybe kind of takes you back there too, if people have seen that show. Um, no, he was known, as a humorist, for his wit and satire and so on. And sometimes that got him in a bit of trouble, or certainly created a lot of controversy at times around his columns and his writing. And what would you say about that? He evolved over the years. I felt that as I worked my way through the book. But he was just quite a character. I remember my parents, and that was why I was so keenly interested to talk to you, that they always hung on reading Ray Guy's column because they almost never knew what was going to be there.
Well, these were. Remember when Ray started to working at the Telegram, which was in 1963, had a summer there in 1962. Newfoundland had been a province of Canada for just a little over a decade. So the sense of the place was very different from what it is today and what it has become. It still kind of thought of itself as almost like a country. It was much more than a province. And getting used to the Canadian experience took some time. I think most Newfoundlanders now would see themselves as, fully fledged Canadians, but not in the 1960s and certainly not in the 1950s. The other thing that was happening is that by that time, a decade and a half or so into Confederation, Newfoundland was still under the premiership of J.R. Smallwood. However, J.R. Smallwood was becoming increasingly controversial for a whole bunch of different reasons. His economic development practices and policies, his relatively, high-handed manner of governing and ruling. And Ray set himself up, and I don't think it was a conscious thing. I think it was a natural thing as his antagonist. And they both had incredible platforms to spar from. Joey, of course, being premier, could say whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted, and had reporters following him around to make sure that everybody heard it. And Guy developed his place over 2 or 3 years as the page 3 columnist in the Telegram, certainly whose nemesis was obviously Smallwood. And there's much more to Ray than humor and satire. Ray had very clear political perspectives about what was going on at the time. And he made them well known in language that people really appreciated because he was such a good writer. And also, he had the gift of satire, which enabled them to make overly serious people, one of whom would have been Premier Smallwood at the time, to make them look a little silly at times, and a little overconfident and a little over bloated. So it was a rivalry that lasted for 7 or 8 years, and it's indisputable. I think most people would acknowledge that Guy had a real role in the reckoning that Smallwood eventually had with the voters of Newfoundland.
Yeah, it would have been quite a time, and you know what? It passed me by. I was probably not on the island, and when I was here, I was still too young to care.
Yeah, and one of the dynamics about Ray, I would make the case and make the argument, I think, with some confidence that in his time, in his era at the Telegram, Ray was probably the best newspaper writer in Canada, but almost nobody knew him outside of Newfoundland. And part of that was, as I said before, the place was still kind of a bit of a watertight compartment down there. And as we lived it at the time, Ray's obsessions and interests and his comfort zone was all about Newfoundland. Conversely, mainland Canada was not obsessed with Newfoundland, or some would argue not much interested at all, except for certain quirks that it had, and some people got to know the place and like it. But we were kind of hermetically sealed, I think, certainly during the 50s and into the 60s. And Guy was appreciated, unknown, relatively unknown, and underappreciated really until the 1980s when he started to write for a magazine based in Halifax, Atlantic Insight. Then he became quite well known, in fact, in Atlantic Canada, in the Maritimes, in Newfoundland. He was already well known, and I think fairly widely appreciated, particularly in Nova Scotia.
That was a great magazine. I used to read that magazine all the time. And also, you said, his column was on page 3, which back in the day, that was where you wanted to be as a columnist. That was the place to be. And then this is what I felt. There was the floating column. He got moved. He came in one day, his column wasn't on page 3, and then it was moved around a bit, and then the newspaper was sold, and a lot of these things played in his mind. That's what I felt from your book, that this was that kind of pedestal that he sat on, where he was guaranteed to be in that position and have that respect, was by nature of just evolution being eroded over here somewhat. And then he was trying to find, I guess, his ground in other ways, which maybe is what took him to the CBC and Atlantic Insight. But he did go back to the paper at one point.
Well, he basically left the paper in 1974 from his position as a page 3 full-time columnist, and mostly page 3, but as you say, moved around a little bit. That was about 2 years or close to it after Mr. Smallwood had retired or been retired. And there's a sense in which Guy had built up such a reputation and such a career identification as being the sparring partner with Smallwood, that in a sense, I think he missed him. Also, whatever anybody thought of the Smallwood and the Smallwood government and the Smallwood Times, they were not boring. Newfoundland politics, you could argue, became less interesting after Smallwood than it had been for his 20 years or so of premiership. The other thing too, and a bigger factor than that, I think it's fair to say, is that the newspaper itself became less interesting. It did get sold, and it got sold to one of the worst newspaper chains in creation, which was the Thompson newspaper chain. It diminished the paper. It cut its resources. It reduced its staff. And Guy could see all of that writing on the wall. There was no direct interference with Ray's work or any attempt to censor or reduce him in that way. But the paper itself had lost a lot of its torque, and he could see the writing on the wall. So eventually, I think he just got tired of it. Also, he started doing it when he was in his early 20s, and by the time he left, he was 34. In a sense, he devoted all of his young adult years to the Telegram. And I mean, he devoted them to the Telegram. He didn't have a large life outside of work. He had some friends, he hung out with a few people, me included in the early days, but he didn't have a broad social life. He was a bachelor. He worked long hours. He worked into the night. He had a bizarre habit of working when it was dark and sleeping when it was light. So he'd fried up a lot of his best years in the interest of the Telegram, which I think it's fair to say was also in the interest of Newfoundland and Labrador culture at the time, and certainly in the interest of Newfoundland letters.
And I mean, through all of that, I think he was about 36, I think, when he eventually did get married. But he also struggled, and I'm not sure at what point you would know better, with depression. He was diagnosed as bipolar, and which is sometimes described as the brilliant madness, which would make sense in his case. And he also was an alcoholic. Would that be the right way to describe it, or just had an issue with
I mean, he eventually, the alcoholism part of it, was not that uncommon. If you start drinking relatively excessively and frequently in your early 20s or even in your teens or college years or stuff like that, your chances of having it capture you and take you over and continue with you are pretty high. And that's essentially what happened to Guy, just in terms of that piece of business. Unfortunate, but yes, I think by the time he was maybe as young as 30, it's probably fair to say, and experts would probably say he's an alcoholic. He also suffered from depression, which, as you say, was eventually diagnosed as that particular condition, which is still, I think, relatively understood or less well understood, and it had a huge impact on his life. So yes, he was up and down, it's the remarkable thing about Ray and his work is that the, the size, the magnitude of the body of work is what it is, despite these sorts of fetters that he dealt with, throughout his entire life.
Absolutely. And when you look at it, it's a beautiful perspective that you just put it in, which I think you're very capable of doing. I'm just going to, if I can, show a few pictures here on the screen. This is him at a young age, or you can best comment.
Well, I love these photos from the mid '50s because they have dates on them. And this one, I think, is 1957. I can hardly see it from here, but July. And he's with a couple of his. He's 18 at the time in '57, I guess, is what he would be. And the woman on the left, her name is Edna. I think her name now is Edna Penny, and I don't know if that's a married name or not. And the woman on the right is Daphne Guy, I think, and not a sister, maybe a distant cousin. Friends. Ray had lots of friends. He grew up well, in a sense, in Arnold's Cove, and he was a kind of mischief leader all of his life. He wrote all the school plays and things like that, and he was a character when he was 10. Most people don't become characters until they're older. This photo is with Kathy Hauser, and there's a child in the background. Don't know who that is. Don't know who the dog is. This is when they lived on the Tolt Road, which was the second last place they lived, and relatively late in Ray's both his career and his life. I think this photo is probably right about the turn of this century, maybe 2002 or 3, something like that. Before they moved back into St. John's for the last, I think, half dozen years of Ray's life. But this is when he was on the Tolt Road, when they were on the Tolt Road, and they had a magnificent view of Conception Bay. And that was actually a house and a garden. They're famous gardeners, those two. That Ray had picked out himself. So it was one of the happier places that they resided in.
Looks so much like that. And that's the bench.
This is the famous bench. I'm not sure what metal this is made of, but it's something very durable. It was quite expensive. I think it was made in British Columbia. It's installed in concrete. It's probably maybe stainless steel, I'm not sure. And it's the Ray Guy bench. And it sits outside of a very small little building that you can't see here. You can just see the ramp going up to it, which used to be a schoolhouse in Arnold's Cove and one of Ray's schools, Ray's only school in Arnold's Cove, I think. And the people sitting on the bench are Iris, Ray's sister, a big player in the book, by the way. Iris's contribution to the book is almost unmeasurable or immeasurable. And Seamus is her grandson. Seamus, I think, is living in maybe Montreal. He's living somewhere outside the province, but he was home for holiday. This happened in August when the bench was opened or dedicated, and a number of us had the good luck to be out there for the event. It was quite a wonderful event. So that's the Ray Guy bench, and there's a quotation from Ray on the bench, which you can't see. It's right behind Iris there, and it says, "In a village, you are thoroughly known." That's the quotation from Ray. And that's from a column that he wrote. I think it would have been around the mid-'90s, or maybe earlier in the '90s. I should have this date, but I don't. When his dad passed away in Arnold's Cove, and Ray went out for the funeral and wrote a lovely, endearing piece about Arnold's Cove, in which that line is one of the many.
Yeah, it's a beautiful tribute to him, and a place where we can go sit and maybe feel his energy. This is him thinking, I think, in deep thought
This is very late in his life. I think this photo might be as late as, it seems to me that it might be around 2011, when Ray, I don't think he had he was experiencing the terminal illness that finally caught up with him, but his health was not in great shape. I think this is in, I think it's the one on the South Side Road in St. John's. I think it's Fort Amherst, kind of looking out the Narrows, and he just seems to be looking out deep in thought and meditation.
Mm. I'm just going to pull that down and just put the book cover up. Ron, because of our few technical difficulties in the beginning, I'm entirely unsure at what point we are at in my in my timing. So I'm going to move us towards wrapping,
Sure.
so that I don't run over time. But I wanted to put the cover of the book up and acknowledge also Boulder Books, who are behind so many of these wonderful, wonderful books that bring so much of our culture. I know that Gavin Wills is very passionate about these types of projects, and I'm sure it was a good fit for you.
Yeah, well, Boulder has done well and done right by Ray. They've published two large compilations of his Telegram columns. And in fact, Gavin Will went through the trouble and probably expense of having just about every column hard copied, Xeroxed and copied, which was a great bonus for me because I could get, once I had a contract with Boulder, I had access to them, and it saved me a lot of time in the from the archives. So Boulder, yeah, they did a good job of producing the book and packaging the book. And, you know, as I say, they have a long-standing and well-known commitment to Ray and his legacy.
Yeah. Well, and you have certainly, what I wanted was to be instilled and to learn more about this, because I grew up with it, like I say, on the fringes and not really understanding it. Your book was amazing to read, and I highly recommend it. And I just want to thank you so much for doing that, for writing it, because it's an incredible project and a great deal of work.
Well, I want to thank you for letting me talk about it. Thanks very much.
I'd like to talk longer. And maybe I could, but I'm not sure of my timing. But maybe we'll do something again a little later.
I'll come back.
All right. Thank you. And thanks, folks, for joining us. Let's Get Writing, available on Facebook, YouTube, and your favorite podcasts. Have a great day.